Nancy Salome Erickson. I was born in Orange, New Jersey on September 26, 1945.
And what was your family background like, including ethnic background?
Basically, Protestant, middle class. My parents and my parents' families mostly had been in the United States for a long time. My mother, since before the Revolutionary War, my father, where the Erickson came from, was from Norway in the mid-1800s. And my parents met when they were in the Army. My mother had been a champion swimmer for a long time. She almost made the Olympics, not quite.
Wow.
And she went to college in Brooklyn, where I now live.
Uh-huh.
She went to Pratt Institute for art. She became an art teacher, went to Dayton, Ohio to teach art, and then when the really bad times hit in terms of economics, she was told, well, all the women were told, well, we'll have to let you go because the men need the jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So she went back to New Jersey, where my grandparents, her parents, lived. And my grandmother was ill at that time. I never knew my grandmother, but she was ill at that time, so my mother took care of her. And they traveled a little bit, actually, around the world. Very early. To me, it seemed like it was early to be going around the world.
Yeah.
In planes, no less.
Oh.
But my grandfather, her father, had made a little money in his job. He was a professional, and they were able to take some of these trips. They did that. My mother also was teaching swimming, but that didn't make too much money. And then the war came along, so she went into the WAC, W-A-A-C, WAC,
right,
Women's
right.
Auxiliary Army Corps, and met my father in kind of on the border between the United States and Canada. She was in the area of interpreting codes that were going back and forth. Secret codes. We asked her about it, but she said, "Oh, we were sworn to secrecy. We can't tell anything about it." So we never found out what exactly she did.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's interesting.
She was always good at that kind of stuff. So I can imagine that she was good at it. So she met my father there, and they got married. And now, married women weren't allowed to be in the military then, so she had to leave. She would have had to leave anyway because the WAAC was being changed to WAC, so all the women had to re-enlist if they were going to continue. So she did not re-enlist.
Right.
So my father was in the Army, and my brother was born in 1944. I was born in 45. Then my father came back from the Army and was working as a salesman for a trucking company. And then the Army called him back in, I think it was 1948, and said, "We want you to go to China to help get the Japanese out of Manchuria." He went. My mother wanted to go, but they wouldn't let families go. And the irony of this, of course, is that he and the United States Army were trying to help Chiang Kai-shek while Mao was taking over China. So that was pretty amusing for me to look back on, after I got old enough to understand what was going on.
So what was your life like growing up before you got involved in the women's movement?
It was pretty ordinary, I would think. At that time, most moms were stay-at-home moms, which my mother was. Went to school. I loved school. I loved reading. I was a real bookworm. And then I went to college, and first I went to Hope College in Holland, Michigan, because I was thinking of majoring in religion and psychology, or not psychology, religion and philosophy.
Huh.
And then I decided to change my major to history and to transfer to a school that had a better history department. So I transferred to Vassar, which at that time was all women.
Right.
And
it was quite a switch from Hope College to Vassar.
Yeah. No, well, I liked Vassar a lot, except it was not at all feminist, not one single bit.
Right.
At that time. As a matter of fact, the president at that time was hardly encouraging to women to do anything but be mothers and help with charitable work and stuff like that.
Right. Sure. Volunteer. Yeah.
Yeah, volunteer work in the community. So then I had planned to get a PhD in history or to become a minister. Actually, I was thinking a lot of becoming a minister, but my particular Protestant denomination did not ordain women.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also saw you had to. It was a very, very strict program. I mean, you had to learn not only Hebrew and Greek but Aramaic.
Oh my!
And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm up for this. But I thought I would be a history professor in college. So I moved to New York City with a friend of mine. I lived with a roommate, a friend of mine. So I graduated in '67 and pretty much moved right in with my friend, and then started working for the Department of Social Services in New York City. They needed a lot of workers at that time. I had been working there, I guess, for about a year. I met somebody who was also working there. We got married, and we decided we would join the Peace Corps. So we applied for the Peace Corps, and interestingly enough, we got, or I got, and he got, an invitation from the Peace Corps to be going to India on the same day as he got his draft notice.
Oh.
Yeah. So he could get out of the draft notice by going into the Peace Corps. So we went into the Peace Corps, even though our marriage was a little shaky at that point. But we went into the Peace Corps, went to India, and we were in a group of volunteers that was primarily married couples.
Uh-huh.
A few single people, but few single men. I don't know that there were any single women, but mostly married couples. So we were training first in California to learn the language, Hindi, and then we went to India. We were based in Rajasthan, which is a desert. Our program was to teach how to grow vegetables, because apparently the Peace Corps had done pretty well with their programs in the south for rice and the north for wheat, but that's not enough for a balanced diet. So, so they were sending us over to teach how to grow vegetables. Now, as time went on in that program, the women were more and more doing different things than the men, and finally a bunch of us women went to the Peace Corps head people and said, why are we not doing the same things as the men? And they said, well, we really don't think that women can do much in India in the Peace Corps, because it's a very, male-oriented society, and they don't really respect women. And but we wanted to send married couples because single men going over to India, it's not been a good experience because single men really can't date. It's not part of the Indian tradition of dating,
right.
Especially if you're not, another person from India, and all the different cultural things like which particular part of the Indian culture are you from, which religion, which whatever. So they said we had very bad experience with single men, so we thought it'd be better to send married couples so that that kind of problem would not arise. So many of us, the women, decided to go back to the United States because we didn't like being treated like that. And so my husband and I went back. We then, as I said, things had been shaky with us, and so we decided when we got back to split up. First, I was looking for a job, and every job I went to, it was discrimination. For example, the one that really stands out was I went to apply for a job with CARE.
Right.
The CARE packages people.
Right.
And it was an ordinary job. It was just kind of a administrative assistant type of job. But then the woman who was interviewing me asked why was I interested in CARE in particular. And I said, well, I thought maybe I could work my way up into an overseas position because I've been in the Peace Corps in India and I liked certain parts of it. And she said, we have never had a woman in an overseas position, and we never will.
Oh, okay.
So that was the kind of thing I was running into, besides the fact that the New York Times and other newspapers, the way they advertised was wanted male help, wanted female, actually.
Right,
This is the way they had put it. I was with a roommate there in New York and finally got a job just working for an organization that was related to church issues that I had been interested in. It was located in what we called the God Box, which is up on Riverside Drive near Columbia and Jewish Theological Seminary and there's another seminary up there. So anyway, I was working there. My roommate one day said, I found out about this organization. It's called NOW, and it's about women getting together and fighting for equality and stuff like that. And I said, oh, great, so I'm going to go. So that's when I started getting involved with NOW. That was 1969 in the spring. 1970, I became the treasurer of NOW New York City. The August 26th march, I couldn't go to the march because I had to, I wasn't my employer wouldn't let me off for the day, but I was doing a lot of work behind the scenes for that to get it ready and so on.
Right.
So that's how I got involved in the women's movement.
What other things did you do in NOW specifically? I
had been interested in legislative and judicial things, and was thinking of going to law school by that time because I hadn't really seen many women lawyers, and I figured, well, that's what we need. We need lawyers. So I was in the Legislative and Judicial Committee. Charlene Sunnison, she was either head of the committee or at least she was very, very involved. I remember she was very, very involved. I was also in the abortion committee with Cindy Sisler and Jim Clapp, and they started New Yorkers for Abortion Law Repeal. I was in that. I was in the education committee. I was involved in a lot of the committees. I helped start the Brooklyn Now chapter. I don't even remember why in particular. Maybe because Ann Wallace I think she was DeLeo at that time. Ann Wallace DeLeo was, I think, living in Brooklyn at that time, and we realized there was a need for a Brooklyn chapter. I started law school in 1970, so the fall of 1970. So from 1970 to 73, I was in law school, and still doing stuff on women's issues. I went to Brooklyn Law School. It was interesting, the application situation, because I had not really even given a lot of thought to applying to Columbia, because I knew, even though that was a very good school, because at that time it had a quota on women. Mm-hmm. And it had a quota on women in the law school and also in the architecture school. I had a friend who was in the architecture arena. But I applied to other law schools, and I was waitlisted on NYU, but I couldn't afford it. I was not being supported by my parents or anybody else. So I went to Brooklyn, and that was good. Uh-huh. It was a good school. I was on the law review. We got on the law review by writing an article, or being at the top of your class. And then when we got on the law review, we had to write an article. And the interesting part involving women's issues was that we were asked to look and see what good, meaty cases had been coming down from the United States Supreme Court or from other important courts. And I chose to do my law review article on Phillips against Martin Marietta Company, which was one of the first, if not the first, case involving Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And that's what I wanted to do. And the editors said, that's not important, blah, 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 you know. And so I had to fight to be allowed to do my article on that when, in fact, it was such an important case. And at that time, women were finally starting to go into law school in some numbers.
Yeah.
Now, the previous class, previous to me, had been 4% women. My class was 8% women.
Okay. So it's double.
Yeah. We thought it was pretty big, but it was still pretty sexist.
Yeah,
the school had just moved into a new building, and they had not anticipated the number of women who would be coming. So there weren't enough women's bathrooms.
Of course, right.
They had to solve that problem, which they did. There were no women professors at all. In fact, I'm trying to think. I don't think there were any women professors until after I left. And my group of women students had a lot of feminists in it. So we started the first women law students organization. That still is going on as far as I know.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So you've used your law degree and your law experience in a ton of ways to help women. Do you want to talk about some of those?
Well, I first went to a firm. I went to work for a firm after law school, and by that time I was remarried, and my husband was a doctor, pediatrician. I started working for a big law firm because I was top of the class. So they were starting to take women, and it was horrible. It was really horrible. The firm's not in existence anymore, so I don't feel bad about saying that, but they were pretty sexist. Ironically, I had decided to go to that firm because they had 2 women partners, which was unusual at that time.
Right, yeah, for sure then, yeah.
But they were the least feminist women you might ever want to meet. When I was hired, it was a big time then for firms to say that they were doing pro bono. They were allowing their attorneys to do pro bono work. When I was hired, I asked about that, and the person who was doing the hiring interview said, "Oh, yeah, we encourage it. You can do up to a third of your time as pro bono." So I thought that was really good. So I did do pro bono work when I was there. I worked with an organization of women. I'm still in touch with one of them from Brazil, who were doing films, videos on women's issues. And another one was Lady Carpenter. That was an organization that was trying to get women into the trades, which they'd been kept out of for years and years. Mm-hmm. Then the Women's Law Center. Oh, I should have mentioned the Women's Law Center. I started getting involved with that when I was studying for the bar exam in the spring, 73, right, because I just graduated from law school. I had to study for the bar exam. I took the bar exam course at night, and then during the day I volunteered at the Women's Law Center. It was set up by an attorney who was a feminist attorney at that time, and Emily Jane Goodman is her name. She's now a retired judge.
Uh-huh.
And she, it was basically a call-in kind of thing. Women would call in. They had issues, legal issues that they wanted to ask about, and so on. And I thought, oh well, I'm going to get a lot of calls from women who have employment problems, sex discrimination in employment.
Right.
Well, it was not. It was almost entirely family law. So I realized that what women really needed help with was family law more than anything else. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's what got me into interested in family law rather than any other area to go into as a field. But then I was working for the law firm after I took the bar exam, and I didn't do much family law for that firm because that was not something they did. So that's where I started doing some work in family law, and but I didn't stay there long because, as I said, they were pretty sexist. And one thing that happened was that we started in, I guess, September. We started in September, the new group of lawyers, and December they had an end-of-year luncheon. It was primarily a Jewish firm, so they weren't going to call it Christmas luncheon, but it was end-of-the-year luncheon. And it was supposed to be held at the men-only club. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
And a couple of us women, new women at the firm, didn't like that idea because, for one thing, women couldn't go in the front door. We had to go in a special door for women.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we didn't like that idea. So the the two of us, I believe, went to talk with the managing partner about that. And the Century Club, that's what it was, the Century Club. And so reluctantly he changed it to some other place. But I don't think he ever forgave us for that. And so we really, it was not a good match. And even though I had already decided it wasn't a good match, they decided for me that it wasn't a good match. And they suggested that I start looking for another position. And part of that, interestingly enough, was that they were angry at me because I had spent time doing pro bono work.
Like they told you could, right?
Like they told me I could, right? And the person who was telling me, I had been doing too much pro bono work, and maybe I needed to go someplace else where I could do more. I said, well, but Mr. Schulman told me, that I could do up to a third of my time on pro bono work. Well, apparently that got back to Mr. Schulman, and he must have denied it because, But anyway, that's water under the bridge. But the point is that it was not a good place to work for women. So I was looking for another job, and I really didn't care that I wasn't there anymore. I was very optimistic. I think maybe over-optimistic at that point because, I didn't see the barriers that were in front of most women lawyers' faces because I had been editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and that's the top thing in the school, and all this kind of stuff. I had advantages that other women lawyers didn't have. And so I got a job teaching at New York Law School. I was teaching family law, sex discrimination, and some other courses that they needed me to teach. I was there from 75 to 80. And in 79, I applied for early tenure because I'd written and I had, gotten good student comments on my teaching and all of that. But I had also gotten involved politically, which was not a good thing to do at that school because the problem was that the dean was not exactly on the up and up, and the faculty started to suspect something when a report came out giving the average salaries at law schools and then the dean's salaries of the professors, salaries of the deans. Our dean was the highest paid dean in the New York City area, and our faculty was the lowest paid faculty. So we started getting suspicious of what might be going on, and we started looking into, not everybody, but a few of us started looking into what was going on, and we found a lot of stuff that was pretty bad. It looked like the dean was taking bribes to get students in. Anybody who was not entirely for him, he started trying to get rid of, and that included not only me, but also two or three other professors. I went up for early tenure, as I said. The faculty voted to give me tenure, but the dean persuaded the Board of Trustees not to give me tenure. And this is another irony here, that I had a letter of recommendation from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who then was at Columbia. But what did she matter? She's just a woman, And,
right, of course, yeah.
One of the board members, who actually I had done a lot of favors for because he was teaching at Columbia at that time, and I had taken over several of his classes when he was involved with things where he couldn't go to a particular class. He said that all my writings were just narrow feminist articles. The dean and the board, the trustees, denied me tenure, so that was pretty obvious I was not going to get tenure there. So I took a year to go to Yale, get a master's degree in law.
Oh,
and looked around for other teaching jobs. And one of the women that I had known from when you're in law teaching, there's an organization called the Association of American Law Schools, and it had an organization of women, section on women in legal education. So I had been involved in that. I had actually been the chair of that section for a year, and I'd gotten to know a lot of women there. And one of them was Rhonda Rivera, who was one of the first women, lesbian women, faculty members at a law school. And we got along real well, and she suggested that I come teach at Ohio State for this summer, and then if they liked me, maybe they'd invite me back. So that's what happened. I started teaching at Ohio State in the fall of 1980. I was there till 87. My daughter Laura was born in 81. I was also very involved with women's issues there. One of the earliest women's issues that I was involved in was a situation where a friend of mine on the faculty found out that she was pregnant and she wanted to get an abortion. And, this was Ohio, so it was bad enough. But on top of that, she found out that our health insurance didn't cover abortion. So she and I talked, and I investigated it with other people and found out that our policy had covered, it had covered abortion. They took it out right a year or so before that. So it was actually, the thing was resolved on a procedural basis because the school was not allowed to make a change like that without going through certain processes, and they had not gone through those processes. So that's the way we fought it, and we got abortion coverage back. There were actually several other women on the faculty there. It was quite different from either Brooklyn Law School, where I went as a student, or Yale Law School, God knows.
Right, sure.
I think there was one, maybe two. Barbara Underwood actually was teaching there at the time at Yale. She's now Solicitor General.
Oh,
Solicitor General.
Right, right.
So we got to know each other. She's a wonderful person. Oh, and another funny thing, when I was at Yale, I was still doing some work with the ACLU Women's Rights Project. One of the cases I worked on, the only one I really remember now, maybe it was the only one that I did when I was at Yale, was Ludke against Kuhn, and that was a lawsuit by a woman who was a reporter who wanted to get into the men's locker rooms after the games.
Oh,
because that's where you got the stories, right?
Right.
And they kept her out. So ACLU Women's Rights Project worked on that case, and I worked on that brief, and we won. And I remember walking through the little TV room area of Yale Law School, and that came on the TV about how this case had gone, and all these guys were sitting around the TV, and they were going, oh, man, oh, that's terrible, and I'm walking by. So that was a fun thing.
You want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done related to women and family law and domestic abuse and all of that? I know you've been involved a lot in that issue.
Emily Goodman's Women's Law Center was what started it. And then when I was teaching, I got more and more interested in family law and whether it was really fair to women. There was a time when the Association of American Law Schools started to get interested in getting sex discrimination issues into all of the different courses. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of the people most involved with this. And I decided I would take a look at criminal law because I didn't know anything about criminal law, basically, except what I found out when I went to law school. I never practiced it, never had anything to do with it, never taught it. So I thought, well, this would be a good area for me to look at is criminal law and how it treats women. We knew that the rape laws were terrible, right? What about other things? What about other parts of criminal law? Well, that turned out to be so interesting because it was very involved with family law, which I had not expected. For example, domestic violence is obviously a crime. There was nothing in the criminal law case books on domestic violence. My project, which I got funding for from Ohio State, my project was on women's issues in criminal law. And so I was looking at 6 or 7 of the most often used criminal law case books for teaching students about criminal law. And I was looking at how did the cases treat women? How did the books treat women? How the authors of the books, what cases did they choose? How did they treat them? That kind of thing. And I knew that rape law would be really terrible, but I didn't know that family law would also be terrible. And as I said, obviously domestic violence is a crime. There was nothing on domestic violence in the criminal law case books except that there's a section in every criminal law case book on self-defense. Okay, so when I looked at those sections of the criminal law case books, I started to realize, hey, a lot of these defendants in the self-defense cases are women. And why is this happening? I mean, the only other place that usually saw women in the criminal law case books was rape victims, and defendants in prostitution cases. But then there was this whole group of women who were in the self-defense area of the part of the case book. Well, so I decided I would read, how any case book doesn't give you the entire case. They just give you a part of the case that they think is most relevant to the material they're trying to teach. So I went back and I read the entire case, or the entire cases that were in the self-defense area of the books. And lo and behold, many, many of them were domestic violence cases. And the defendant, the woman who had killed and had said that she was killing in self-defense were abused women. So I ended up writing an article that was so long after I did that that study that we couldn't get anybody to publish it for years. We finally got. Let's see. It was Rutgers Law School in Newark published it, and it was practically the whole journal issue. It took up so much. But
it's really groundbreaking, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, and others were being published along those same lines, like one on property law and women. Just about every law school topic people were writing, mostly women were writing articles on how the case books and other materials treated women in that particular field of law. And so it was a very exciting time. And I'm very curious as to what later happened. I know that a couple of case books changed a lot, but I don't know what happened across the board. But the basic concept, which I should have set out at the beginning of talking about it, the basic concept was that most schools by that time in the 80s started having courses on women in the law or sex discrimination in the law.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't, by the way, it was not gender in the law, which is what it is now, which is really different. It was women in the law, but the thought was, why should we have women in the law stuck in a separate course when it really pervades the entire legal system, right? So that was the impetus for having all these studies on different areas of the law and how they treated women. Oh, I forgot to mention that while I was teaching in the 70s, early 80s, I started getting involved with women's legal history because I loved history. So I was starting to read all about women's history. That's when lots of women were going into teaching history and doing research on women's history. So I was trying to put them together, women's legal history. And so was Wendy Williams at, where was she? In D.C. I've forgotten which school in D.C. she was at. But anyway, she's now writing writing a biography on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But she was teaching, and she and a colleague put together materials on women's legal history. And so I was doing some of the same thing, doing a lot of reading, putting together materials on women's legal history, and I taught it a couple of times. Once at NYU, in the history department, not in the law school. But that was very interesting. I wish I had time to do more reading and studying on that. So that was during my time at the law school. And then in 1986, I decided I wanted to try going back to New York because I really wasn't crazy about Ohio. I wasn't used to the culture, and it was pretty sexist and pretty racist at that time. I'm hoping it's better now. But anyway, my daughter Laura was then about 5, and I didn't like the idea of her growing up in that kind of environment. So we came back to New York for a year off from Ohio State, and I was teaching at Seton Hall Law School in Newark, New Jersey, just across the river, and then decided to stay in New York. So I had to get a different job because that was just a 1-year position.
Uh-huh.
And I started looking for for jobs that were part-time because Laura was only 5, and I didn't want to be,
Right.
away from home that much. So I found 2 part-time jobs in the entire city of New York as a lawyer. One, and both were government. One was working for Corporation Counsel, which is the law firm that represents the city of New York. There are a few hundred attorneys in Corporation Counsel. And then the other one was, I think, the Attorney General's office. I went to the Corporation Counsel's office. I was there for, I think, a little more than 2 years, maybe. And I got involved with the National Center on Women and Family Law, writing books and other things for them as a side job, kind of. And ultimately ended up getting hired by them to be a staff attorney. Now that was a really good organization, because the way it was run was, or the way it was planned, was to be a backup center for legal services attorneys in the area of family law, women and family law.
Uh-huh.
Like the other backup centers, for example, housing law, public benefits law, juvenile law. There were backup centers. Employment law was another big one. There were these backup centers spread out throughout the country on different areas of law where the legal services attorneys out in the field, if they had a question about some area, they could call and they could say, where can I find some good research on this topic or that topic, and or get some advice on how to handle this case, and that we were responding to them.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
So that was a very, very interesting job, and I learned a lot more about family law in that time, particularly in terms of custody. It was, well, the first thing I think was child support, because up until 1975, child support was basically each state, each jurisdiction, maybe each county did whatever they wanted, whatever way they wanted. But then the federal government got very concerned because there were so many women with children on public assistance, and most of them were not getting any child support. So how could they ever get off of public assistance?
Right, sure.
So
yeah.
The federal government passed a lot of laws regarding getting child support from the non-resident parent. And each state ultimately was required to follow certain guidelines on child support. They were supposed to, create their own guidelines, and the guidelines had to make sense. They had to come up with a reasonable amount of support from the non-custodial parent, and the states had to have certain enforcement proceedings in effect, and so on and so forth. So that hit around 1979. Well, from 75 it started, through 79, through the 80s. Finally, in 1989, New York finally gave in. There was a deadline that the Fed put on it, and it was 1989, and sometime in October. And I think on the last day, or almost the last day before that deadline hit, New York finally passed its child support guidelines.
Amazing.
So this was very new.
Right.
Yeah, this was very new in New York. And so one of the things that I did a lot of work on was child support guidelines. I wrote a book for the National Center on Women and Family Law on child support guidelines throughout the country, which ones were similar, which ones were different, how they were devised, how they operated, all that kind of stuff.
What would you say, just looking back, Nancy, is like maybe your greatest accomplishment or your most memorable experience, in your activism life?
There were a lot of them. I think that one of the most important is that there's a very big divide, generally speaking, between academics and practicing attorneys with regard to family law. And Flo Kennedy used to say that the ass-by-ass process of getting the rear ends of individual women out of the wringer is very tiring and frustrating. But and you can get away from that, as I did, by teaching. But you don't really learn what's going on in individual women's lives. And so I'm glad that I went back into the practice of law, and I was able to represent the individual women and find out what was really happening. And what was really happening is pretty simple to understand on one level, and that is that why do women oftentimes lose custody cases when the myth is that women always get custody? Well, duh, who has the money, right?
Right, sure.
And if the father wants custody, he is likely to get it. If he's the one who's got the money, which he usually is. And then on top of that, we started getting hit with this concept of parental alienation syndrome, which started in the 80s with Richard Gardner, a psychiatrist who claimed that women were alienating their children against the fathers, and that the courts should look at this and take these kids away from these mothers and to protect them from being alienated against the fathers. And this has really been an incredibly huge problem for women. So I've been working on this for years. I wrote an article on it. I've been doing amicus briefs on it. It's a never-ending battle, it seems. Although there have been some good cases, and it appears that maybe some courts are finally realizing that this parental alienation is really garbage science. It's not science at all, and that it should not be used to harm children who end up going to live with a parent that they don't want to live with, and the parent who they want to live with is left without them. I got into that partly because eventually I started after the National Center on Women and Family Law folded because the federal government stopped funding all the backup centers, so they either had to fold or they had to get their own independent money, and the National Center on Women and Family Law did not get independent money. So, so I went into practice, and eventually I was with the legal services in Brooklyn here, and I started seeing women who had lost custody because the courts had ordered a custody evaluation to be done in their cases, and usually they're done by a psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker, usually psychologists, and the evaluators, custody evaluators, were starting to get imbued with this concept of parental alienation, and lots of them were claiming that the mothers were alienating the children, which they weren't, especially in domestic violence cases. As soon as the mother said that she had been abused, or that the children had been abused in some way, then the father would jump back with, "Oh no, I'm totally innocent, and she's just bad-mouthing me to the kids. She's alienating me from them, and this is parental alienation, and I should get custody." So I was so confused about all of this and why the custody evaluators would be believing all this, and women were losing custody, that I decided maybe there was something wrong with me. I didn't really understand. I should understand what these custody evaluators were doing. So I went to get a master's in forensic psychology, and lo and behold, discovered there was nothing wrong with me. It was wrong. What was wrong with these psychologists and psychiatrists? The social workers were better, by and large, but most of the custody evaluators were psychologists, and they really had absorbed all this stuff about parental alienation and really thought that it was the new science, which it's not. So we've had to be fighting that for all of this time, ever since then. So that's what I've mostly been doing. And I started getting more and more involved with actually representing battered women and hearing about their stories. I realized how many of them were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and other conditions like that because of the domestic violence. And there were many of them who were even disabled, really, on account of it. It made it very difficult for them to proceed with their cases because, for one thing, they could barely stand to go near any place where their abuser was. So going into court was a nightmare.
Right. Sure.
Then they would get there, and as soon as they would see him, they would really have flashbacks and all kinds of stuff related to their PTSD, or they would get frightened. They would get frightened, or they couldn't function in the court. And so I started talking with other women who were interested in how to help these women. One of them was Karen Huffer, Huffer, who just passed away, unfortunately. But she started a program to try to help not only women who disabled women who had to go into court, but anybody with a disability who had to go into court and was not recognized as such by the court system. I mean, the court system under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they've gotten so that they can understand, okay, if somebody's in a wheelchair, then we have to do this, that, and the other. If somebody has a hearing disorder, whatever. But what they don't understand is these invisible disabilities like PTSD. Now that we're having a lot of service people coming back from being in battle, I think hopefully they're going to start to see what they have to do with litigants who are in that kind of situation. But this was pretty new at that time when, I think it was around 2011, I started getting involved, and Karen had just written her book, I think. So that's been a big push of mine, too, and several other women lawyers have gotten involved with me on it. So hopefully that will help a lot of battered women, because it's really unfair for them to not only be up against the richer person, but also to be disadvantaged by the fact that their disabilities are such that it's hard for them to function within the system. So I'm glad that we're being able to do that.
That's great. Well, you have done amazing things. I'm incredibly impressed and grateful to you and for what you've done and for sharing your story.